factors that Rabbi Kook took in. Like Rabbi Kook took in this, that, and that. He said, this is what it says about the Messiah, son of David, of Joseph, and this is what is happening. But he left out certain figures of Messiah, son of Joseph. So we expanded it. The Messiah, son of Joseph, the Messiah has the lost 10 tribes. And the whole story of building up, of building the state, is initially attributed to the Messiah, son of Joseph. So what happened historically? Historically, you had a whole process. You had a whole process in Britain, in America. You had the restorationist movement, beginning from Oliver Cromwell, actually before Oliver Cromwell, the 1600s. But in his time, it became stronger. The idea that we should give the Jews their own land, should bring them back to the land of Israel, and give them their own country. And some of these thinkers were Christians. Some of them said that they should also convert them to Christianity, because that is obviously they were fanatical Christians, very devout Christians, and they thought it was a good thing to convert the Jews. So they said they convert the Jews to Christianity, bring them back to the land of Israel, and help them have their own state. Others, even that didn't even agree with that. Without converting them, we should give them their own country. So from the beginning, this second idea also existed, to leave Judaism as it is and to give the Jews their own country. This was known as the restorationist movement, and it was very popular amongst certain Christian intellectuals in Britain, also in America. President Bush, an ancestor of President Bush, wrote a book about it, and it's well known. Also, this restorationist movement, there's several good books written about it, describing it. It wasn't universally popular. The whole idea you have to be a religious Christian to appreciate, at least at the beginning, and you had to be religious. You didn't have to be a religious Christian, but most people in that time in England were either religious Christians or they'd been brought up on the Bible. The Bible was a very important book, and when they read the Bible, they understood from the Bible that the God of the Bible wanted the Jews to live in the land of Israel, that it would be a good thing according to the God of the Bible. And if we want to help the God of the Bible, in other words, to identify the God of the Bible, we should help the Jews do this. And also the people in France, the people in Spain, but it was predominantly mainly in England that had this idea, and had this idea amongst famous writers. A good portion of the population had been exposed to it. So, and also about in the 1800s, there were pogroms in Eastern Europe. And later, and also after that, the Jews were being killed in Russia, in what's now the Ukraine. And they were, then the newspapers, the media had developed itself. This was being known, described, illustrated. And a lot of these refugees didn't have anywhere to go. And a lot of people wanted to help the Jews and wanted the refugees to come to their countries. But this wasn't always practical, and others didn't want it. This was also anti-Semitism. They wanted to help the Jews. They didn't necessarily want them living next door to them. There were all kinds of prejudicial concepts concerning the Jews. But nevertheless, they wanted to find a solution. So they're also looking around for other places where the Jews could go to. The idea is to give the Jews part of Australia, Western Australia, Central Australia, all places in South America, or parts of the USA, or they're looking, or later on what is now Kenya, Uganda, places like, or some place in that part of Egypt, all different areas. And actually, these solutions, if they had been taken, that would have helped. Possibly, it would have helped save a lot of Jews from being killed later in the Holocaust. At all events, the idea that they have to find another place for the Jews was very prevalent. And this was not only this was not necessarily in the land of Israel. And then the war broke out. The First World War broke out. In 1917, the English conquered what is now known called Palestine. Then it was considered part of Syria, the area of Palestine, the Holy Land. And also, they declared that they looked with favour upon the idea that the Jews should have their own country. And this was paralleled along with this declaration. Before then, Jews had begun to come trickling back into the land. The Jews had always tried to come back into the land to some degree, but the rulers of the land, the Muslims, prevented it, were against it, persecuted the Jews, or prevented many Jews coming in. But nevertheless, over the years, Jews had been coming back, and they built up different settlements. Most of them, the majority of Jews were Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews, but there are also others, non-ultra-Orthodox Jews. And together with what I was describing before about all the pogroms and the problems, Jews were quite numerous in Eastern Europe. Economically, these were primitive areas that weren't developed. There wasn't enough food to go around. There was enough to sustain them, and the population was quite weren't as developed as they should have been, and they took it out on the Jews, their own problems. And together with this, all the people were being oppressed. The rulers of Russia were oppressing their own people. So you had revolutionaries. People wanted to overthrow them. You had the concepts of socialism, extreme socialism, communism, anarchism, all kinds of movements like this. Or just socialist ideas of reforming mankind. So some of these ideas, there were Jews who had taken the idea of Zionism, gone back to the land of Israel, and combined them with the idea of socialist concepts. So they too had started coming back to the land and setting up here and there communities, kibbutzim, and doing their own thing there. The British took over. And the British did a lot, okay? What happened? Had the British taking over. The British came in. The British were colonizers. They were also agents, the employees of governments in England. And they also had their own prejudices, their own concepts. And some of them were colonialists, what is called as they were, one could say, snobbish. They had their own ideas of how people should be. And some of them disliked the Jews. Some of them preferred the Arabs. And some of them didn't. And some of them had anti-Semitic world outlooks or anti-Jewish. But actually most of them weren't. And even those who were personally against the Jews, they saw their task as being to help the Jews build up the land. So on the whole, the British did help build up the land. And the Jewish and the settlements flourished. More and more, relatively speaking, more and more Jews started coming in. And this antagonized the Arabs. The Arabs were afraid of being taken over, so they started all kinds of riots in which Jews were killed. All kinds of problems grew up. And then in 1936, you had the Great Arab Revolt, which lasted for 3 years, and the British suppressed this. About one Arab male in every 5 or 6 was wounded seriously or killed in this struggle, and the British suppressed it, and they, in effect, emasculated it by the effects of what the British did to them were felt all until the end, and it impaired the Arab ability to fight, the local Arab ability, local Palestinian ability to fight against the Jews when the war broke out against the Jews. The British had already killed or dealt with most of their ringleaders, and they had been subdued, one could say. So a lot of people don't know about this, but also towards the end, and that lasted from 1936 to 1939, towards the end, when it died down, they had one could say an inquiry as to what had happened, and they decided that it was caused because the Jews, too many Jews were coming in, and the Jews were buying up lands, and the Arabs felt threatened about it, and so this was causing all the problems. And there was some truth in this. There wasn't really enough room in the country for everyone there. And we should also realize that the British had a responsibility, as far as they were concerned. The British were not, on the whole, were not Jewish, and they're not religious Zionists. They were not Christian evangelists who are, some of them are enthusiastically for religious reasons support of the State of Israel. And there were a lot of the Jews were primitive, or people, refugees from Eastern Europe, and they didn't get on with the British. So each British soldier had his own appreciation of what was going on. So you had a conflict of opinion. The British also weren't actually sure what they were supposed to be doing. They felt responsible for not only for the Jews, but also for the Arabs. And also at that time, the forces were building up in Europe. There's going to be a war any minute. Hitler had gone into Austria. He'd gone into Czechoslovakia. He had broken his word over and over again. He was building up his forces. He was threatening the Second World War. He simply wanting war. And none of them were really prepared for it. And at that time, the British India was very important to the British Empire and to the British economy. And millions, hundreds of millions of Muslims, not a good portion of the Indian population at that time, India included, was now Pakistan and Bangladesh and India itself. That was all India. So they had a large number of Muslims, and other parts of the British Empire had Muslims. And the Muslims, there was a chance that the Muslims would all rise up and revolt. The Nazis were egging them on. The British were afraid that all the Muslims would identify with the Palestinians, as they are doing now. As so too now we have the same problem with all Muslim states identifying with the Palestinians and being against the State of Israel because the Jews are seen by them as threatening aspects of existence which they consider sacred, threatening to take over the Temple Mount, and so on. And they have agitators also from Germany, and also native from the Muslim Brotherhood, different extreme Muslim societies in Egypt and so on, were all agitating and raising up trouble. So the British brought in the white paper that only a certain number of Jews should be allowed in every year, and they curtailed their plans to give the country independence until things should clarify themselves. And at that time the Jews were a minority. And then you had the outbreak of the Second World War. And the British, and there were Jews running around, Jews trying. I should have mentioned, I just backtrack a little bit to put things into a bit of perspective. In addition to the restorationists and the Zionists who helped bring about the Balfour Declaration, you also had Zionist, regular mainstream Zionists, one could say, who were non-religious, such as Chaim Weizmann, but they were self-appointed or appointed by Jewish organizations to lobby on behalf of Zionism. And they were very effective. Chaim Weizmann, for instance, would go and visit every big wig in England. He was personal friends with a lot of them. And a lot of them found it difficult to resist the cogency of his arguments. And there were other Jews like that. Everywhere there was a Jewish community, you had your local Zionist enthusiast would talk to his local politician or talk to his local bishop or talk to other people. And this built up a pressure group, one could say, which was also instrumental in bringing about the Balfour Declaration. And after the Balfour Declaration, this continued. This was supporting the Jews. You had the pressure from the Jews, you had pressure from the Arabs, and you had anti-Jewish pressures, and this was all coming along. And also then you had the Nazis, and together with the Nazis coming to the fore in Germany. Before the Second World War, you had an increase of anti-Semitism throughout the world, not necessarily connected with Germany, but perhaps influenced by Germany. And this was important. So most people at that time, to some degree, were anti-Jewish. For instance, after the Nazis, the Germans took over in 1933, and they took over Germany, and there were a lot of Jews wanted to get out of Germany and go elsewhere. And every country started closing their door, not letting Jews in, or only letting in a small number of Jews. And the Jews had nowhere to go. So this is also an aspect of what was going on. And but a lot of them eventually did find places to go. For instance, 80% of the Jews in Germany did manage to get out, even though a portion of them went to neighboring countries such as France and the Netherlands. And when those countries were later conquered by the Germans, they were the first ones to be given over. Local Jews who had friends, who had roots in the country, were considered part of the local people, were often protected, but foreign Jews from outside were not. So when the Germans took over, these were the first ones who were surrendered by the local populace and were taken away and put to death. And we had the whole story of the Holocaust, and this question what was going on, when it was going on, who knew about it and who didn't know about it. And also the Jews trying to get out of Europe, and officially they were not allowed to go, but actually 200,000 Jews, there was a large number in those days, in terms of those from a very large number, did come to Palestine. I had I never met him, my brother knew him, my brother met him. One of my aunts, one of the sisters of my mother, was married to a Jewish person who had served in the British forces at that time during the Second World War. He was an assimilated Jew. He didn't very much really, I don't know to what degree he identified as Jewish, but he was an ordinary British soldier, and he used to say that they were supposed to look after the beaches to make sure that infiltrators didn't come in. And when they saw Jews coming in, he said they would look the other way. So a large number of Jews did manage to get out of Europe in some way or other. Either they came in from Romania, then into Turkey, and then overland, or they came in ships. And now and again the ships were stopped, and the passengers, the Jewish passengers, were taken and incarcerated, placed on the island of Cyprus, or elsewhere, until the end of the war, and then they too were allowed to come into Palestine. So the Jewish, despite everything, under the British, the Jewish population increased greatly. And then you had the outbreak of the War of Independence, and I have different books we also have contradictions. So British officers in what became in the Jordanian army. They were British sympathizers of the Arabs. But on the whole, many, to a good degree, a reasonable degree, the Jews won the War of Independence against the local Arabs because of British help. The British, before they left, they turned over important strategic areas and the buildings and ammunition and so on to the Jews. And then, Archer mentioned that, it interests me, and I would emphasize that fact. But after that, at the time, you had a Labour government after the Second World War in power in England, which was somewhat anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish, And they, at some stage, they were backing the Arabs who attacked the Arab countries around about to attack the state of Israel and try to destroy it. So I say this, and someone says this, that's something else, and it can be, it's not clear exactly what happened. On the whole, we have books about it, and we've learned about it, and on the whole, the British helped the Jews get to where they got. But everything you say, there's always someone else who can say something against it. It can be embarrassing sometimes to talk. You sit with a number of people and you mention things. I mentioned things to the British did this, the British did that, and said, but the British did something else. Just the opposite. So they themselves were. So that was the way it went. But on the whole, overwhelming forces were in favor of the British after the state of Israel came into existence. The British were somewhat reserved about it at the beginning, but France helped, and after France, the USA helped the state of Israel, they bankrolled the state of Israel. They enormous amounts of aid and money and assistance came from America, and together with that, America, they have the same in America. America is a democracy. You have all kinds of currents and emotions. And together in America, you have those who are pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab or just objective. And they see that in certain cases, we should help the Arabs more. Or we should do things that are adverse to for someone living in the state of Israel, they're considered adverse to him. But you can say the trend, overwhelming trend, is that elements from Britain, France, the USA, help the state of Israel get to where it was going. And these that were doing it, who were they interfacing with? They were interfacing more with secular Zionists. They understood the secular Zionists more than the others, and they helped the secular Zionists. Secular Zionists had a mutual language with them. So you could say that the elements that Rabbi Kook identified as representing the Mashiach ben Yosef were those who received support and were allied with the lost 10 tribes. People we identify as being overwhelmingly descended from the lost 10 tribes. So this fits in with what we are saying. This, it is in effect, proves it. Something that could have been used against our tender way of thinking is in effect, when you look at it objectively, take the overall view, it strengthens it. So that is the situation we still have.